Hello and welcome to Logan Rando Aquascaping. My name is Logan and today I have a pretty big update for you guys on my UNS 60U back there. I set this up back in September of 2021, so it's had several months to really develop and mature, and I'm happy to say that it's doing really well and it has reached autopilot mode. So I do my water changes every week, I feed the fish, I dose the nutrients, the CO2 runs, and everything takes care of itself. So I'll walk you guys through how each of the plants are doing, how the livestock is doing, what we can expect in the future. And I also want to talk a little bit about the things I like about this tank and the things I can do much better next time. Because I think once one of your aquascapes is several months old and you've allowed it to mature, it's cool to take a step back, kind of evaluate the progress you're making as an aquascaper, and then sort of implement that in future projects. So we're going to do that today. So let's dive right in. All right, so starting in the foreground, we have the beautiful Halanthum tenellum green. And just a couple weeks ago, this underwent a brutal hacking down and cutting back, which I like to do every 6 to 8 weeks because it stimulates that lateral, bushy, horizontal growth. So it's gonna come in tighter, it's gonna come in stronger, and it's gonna come in more vibrant. And you can see 2 weeks after the trimming, it's doing really well. It's still a teeny bit patchy in some areas where I was extra brutal with the trimmings, but overall, this plant is really, really resilient and I'm super happy with it. And the guppies love it too. They love sort of just coming down and pecking at the base layer and, you know, feeding on microfauna. So I think it's a really interesting plant to keep in the foreground. It's super easy and it does really well with CO2 and nutrients. And moving on to the midground, we have a ton of Anubias and Bucephalandra that I drove here all the way from upstate New York to Portland, Oregon when I made my move back in late August. And it's doing really, really well. There was a little bit of an adjustment period coming in, not too much melt per se, but the plant was sort of dormant as it readapted to water conditions. And now it's just doing fantastic. I'm seeing new growth all the time, and now I've got flowering all over the place, which to me is just the telltale sign that the plant is well established in your tank. Because you got to think about it this way. Flowering is a way for a plant to reproduce through pollination. And it's only going to do that if it's well established and it's comfortable and it has excess energy to sort of devote towards propagation. Whereas if the plant is struggling, it's not gonna flower because it's gonna be really focused on just survival and nutrient storage and keeping the tissue it does have alive. So whenever you see a plant flowering, you know it's in good shape because it's ready to create more plant. And you'll notice I've got a little bit of BBA on some of the individual leaves in this tank. Really, it's not a problem. I've got it under control. You know you have a bigger issue if it's highly visible from a distance and it's all over the place and it's, you know, starving out your leaves, but that's just not the case in here. Every week, I spot dose a little bit of hydrogen peroxide. That usually kills it on spot, and I just keep an eye on it. So next up in the midground, you'll see on the left and right, I have recently added some Hygrophila pinnitifida. So this came from trimmings in my ADA 45P, which prominently features this. And I didn't want to get rid of the trimmings, so I decided to try it out in here, and it's doing really well. It's a bit leggy right now because it's a bit shaded by the floating plants and the light is in the back, so it has a little bit of a shadow on it. But I'm gonna remove some of the floaters, and I'm also gonna keep trimming this to make it more compact and dense. But overall, pretty healthy. I'm seeing it growing quite a bit, and the fish and the shrimp are enjoying it as well. And if we move on over to the right side of the midground, we have the Cryptocorini green gecko. And this is a plant I haven't talked about a lot because for the first few months of this tank's life, it was kind of just dormant. It melted back a little bit when I added it to the tank, and I really didn't see any sort of significant growth on it for about 2.5 months. But now that it's well established, well rooted, and it's doing great in these water conditions, the growth has really exploded on it. I've even had to trim some of the larger leaves off. So it's a really unique color for a crypt that I don't see too often, and I think it does a really nice job separating the midground from the background. I think eventually when this gets a little bit bigger, I'll see if I can kind of spread some out over to the left side because I do want to keep adjusting this tank and make improvements. My friend Yuri's once told me that anytime you have a highlight on one side of the tank, you should try and have that somewhere else on the other side of the tank as well. You don't want things perfectly symmetrical per se, but if I had some green gecko in the rear foreground on one side, it might be cool to match that on the the other. So I think I'll do that in the not so distant future. And moving on to the background of the tank, we have some really beautiful, vibrant Juncus repens. And I actually just planted this entire background not even a month ago. Originally I had some microsorums, but they weren't doing it for me. The texture wasn't right. I wasn't really loving the growth. And I wanted something more vibrant and fast growing. So I chose the Juncus repens. And I would say it's probably tripled in size and height since I originally planted it. And eventually I want it to get almost up to the surface, so it provides a really, nice, clean, lush background. It's really digging the high lighting though. I recently turned the Twin Star up to its maximum settings. Over the course of about 6 weeks or so, I ramped up the lighting from 60% to 100. So it's gonna really benefit from that. And once I remove some of the floaters, it'll get more light as well. Again, a little bit of BBA on it, but nothing I can't spot treat, do some trimming here and there, just keep it in check. If you're looking for a background plant that you don't have to do a ton of maintenance on, but will still give you those big results, Juncus repens is a good one. It doesn't grow quite as fast as a stem, but grows a lot faster than, say, an epiphyte. So really enjoying that so far. All right, now let's talk about the livestock. So as you can see, there are a bunch of guppies, and about a month and a half ago, I added some female guppies because I wanted to get a little breeding. And I'm happy to say that just yesterday, I saw the first batch of fry. So super excited to get some juvenile guppies in here and get a real community going. They're really enjoying, I think, the Juncus repens for nice coverage in the back, because sometimes guppy do eat their offspring. So it's really important to have hiding places where they can be secure. And in a planted tank like this, there's gonna be a ton of microfauna and little critters for them to feed on. So I'm fairly confident that the offspring will reach adulthood, at least most of them will. And the Caridina shrimp, the crystal reds, are doing really well. I've seen some baby shrimp here and there, so they're breeding. They're always out and about. They love picking at the moss and the individual leaves on all the plants, and I just think they're absolutely stunning. For the longest time, I was so terrified of keeping Caridina because I heard they're so difficult, but fortunately, here in Portland, we have really, really soft water. It comes out of the tap at about 30 TDS, so it's perfect for these types of shrimp. I just remineralize with salty shrimp GH+, take the TDS up to 120, and then that is fairly stable throughout the week. By water change day, it's at 150, so it gets diluted a little bit. So I'm happy to say you can keep these guys in a high-tech tank with CO2, high lighting, fertilizer, and they'll even breed. And lastly, we have the Otto Sinkless, and I love these guys so much. They're such great algae eaters. When I first added these guys to the tank early on in its life, they just wiped out any sort of remaining diatoms. And I just think they're a really beautiful fish. They like to, stay still for photographs and video, which is always fun. And they just look so cool up front. One of the really interesting things I learned about Otto Sinkless is they actually don't grip with their mouths. When you think about suckerfish, you would think that they grip to the glass and plants with their mouth, but they're actually using their pectoral fins to grip onto things. So if you get nice and close, you'll see that. So now that we've talked about all the different plants and the fauna, it's time for a little bit of a post-mortem where I can kind of evaluate what I did right with this tank, what I did wrong, and how I can improve it. Because I want to keep it up for the rest of the year, but I want to see if I can make it better as it sort of matures and develops now that it's an autopilot. So in terms of the things I really like about this tank, I really like the colors. I love how they're various different shades of green. I think the fish choice is just perfect, how that orange just pops right out. I knew I wanted something to pop, and I love how there's the occasional highlight of red here and there. However, in terms of color, one of the flaws is I think the highlights, while they're present, they could be more prominent. So I really want that AR Mini to sort of grow out a little bit, and I want to spread it onto the other side of the tank as well, because the highlights are there, they're just sort of not catching your eye the way they should. And I'm thinking that eventually the Hygrophila pinnitifida will become a little bit of a highlight as well when that sort of colors up and gets more bushy. So I'm gonna try and improve the highlights as the tank develops. Another thing I really, really love about this tank is the midground. I think it's one of the strongest midgrounds I've ever done. I think all the epiphytes and all the different colors really provide something interesting that draws my eye to multiple spots. So that's been a change of pace for me, and I'm really enjoying it. So in terms of aspects that need improvement for this tank, I would say the number one thing for me is the hardscape. When I first set it up, it was a lot more impactful because the stones were visible, the lower branches of the wood were more visible, but as things have sort of grown in and spread out, you're sort of just left with this thin skeleton of a hardscape, and I think it sort of lacks impact. So if I could go back in time, I think I would, maybe have some more wood, and that's not out of the question for the future, but I think as it stands right now with the plants very grown in and spread out, they've sort of dominated the hardscape, and yeah, it just doesn't really draw your eye to different spots the way it should. So I'll see what I can do to improve that in the future, because I know that sometimes adding some stone and adding more wood can achieve better results. And then one more thing that I think is lacking a little bit that could use some improvement is sort of the sandy area. This was just a total experiment for me. When I set up this tank, I was scrolling through Instagram and I saw a similar tank that had a corner patch in it of sand. And I hadn't seen that in many years, and I was like, oh yeah, these used to be very much in vogue for a while. So I wanted to try it in my tank, and I think I've done a pretty decent job with making it look as natural as it could be. That said, for what it is, it just doesn't look that awesome in the tank. You've got this really thick layer of sand in the foreground, which is never ideal. I think it's a lot cooler to keep the sand super thin in the front. And yeah, it just kind of stands out and doesn't have the most naturalistic vibe to it. So I think a better option for this tank regarding the cosmetic sand would have just been to have a thin layer in the foreground, kind of in front of the Holanthium tenuum. I think that would have provided a little bit more intrigue. So that is something I could potentially introduce in the future, though it would be a pretty big maintenance session, but it was an interesting experiment. And that's how you learn in aquascaping. You got to try stuff out, see what works, see what doesn't, and just do the best you can with what you got. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for watching, guys. But before you leave, do me a favor, drop me a comment and let me know how you think I could specifically improve this layout, because now that it's super mature, I think it's gonna be fun that, add little things here and there, maybe even take away things to improve it. So let me know if I should add any plants or hardscape or whatever you think would, make it a better layout, more interesting. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.